Colonel, can I ask you a series of fairly stupid questions, but they are sort of in the ether, and I think they're actually in some ways stupid, but simultaneously really important to address, because there are a lot of things that people say, but when we think about them, we don't necessarily have the answer. So you mentioned that Israel is one of America's and Britain's chief allies around the world and the main one in the Middle East. What is the value of that alliance? A lot of people are now asking. A lot of people in America are saying, if we weren't supporting Israel, we wouldn't have all these jihadi groups hating us. We would be living peacefully in America, and the Middle East would be taking care of itself. Why do we need to be in alliance with Israel?
Well, the Middle East is an important region. Whatever one's perspective from the West, all the things we're doing now, pretty much every activity outside of this room is to some extent, dependent on the Middle East, on oil in particular. And therefore that some kind of stability, and it's a loose word in connection with the Middle East, is important, and Israel provides an element of that stability.
But people would, sorry to interrupt, but people would say quite the opposite. People would say, if we didn't support Israel, it would be a lot easier for us to get Iranian oil and oil from, we just trade with these people who wouldn't hate us anymore.
Except that, as I mentioned before, one of Iran's, and probably Iran's primary objective, when I say Iran, I'm talking about the revolutionary government, their primary objective is the dominance of Shia over Sunni Islam. They're at war with the rest of Islam, basically. And this is why, something that isn't talked about very much, I think, is that most of the Arab countries in the region are right behind Israel. They want Israel to defeat Hamas. They want Israel to defeat Hezbollah. They want Israel to defeat Iran. That includes Saudi Arabia, it includes the UAE, it includes Jordan, it includes Egypt, it includes pretty much every country in the Middle East who see themselves under threat from Iran. Israel is the kind of the strong horse, if you like, in the Middle East. And without that, there's every prospect of far greater instability in the region than with Israel being there and being a strong rock against Iran.
Mm-hmm. What about, can you explain to us, because a lot of people don't know the answer to this question either, what is this conflict really about between Israel and Iran? A lot of people think it's about the occupation. A lot of people think it's about land. But when I look at it and I go, if it were about land, it would have got sorted out a long time ago. Because when it comes to land, people ultimately will negotiate instead of continuing killing each other for 70 years. So what is it really about?
It's a religious war. And Islamic doctrine makes it very clear that if any territory was ever controlled by Islam, it can never be controlled by people who are not Muslims. And that includes Israel. The land there was once part of there's been various iterations over the years, but most recently it was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was essentially was an Islamic caliphate. And therefore it cannot be controlled by anybody else. The Jews they don't have to go. They either have to be killed or they live as second-class citizens under an Islamic government. That is fundamentally what the conflict's about. And when you talk about the occupation, I think you kind of touched on a really misunderstood area, which provides the fundamental basis for many people around the world, including in the UK and the US, etc., belief that Israel is an illegitimate country. Israel's not an occupier. Israel is not an apartheid state. Israel has not stolen Arab land. All of these things which are, illegal settlements, all of these things are lies. They're generated, and I don't want to bore you with too much history, but they were generated originally by the Soviet Union in the mid-60s, which wanted to create a war of national liberation between the Arab world and Israel in order to use that as a weapon against British and American influence in the Middle East. That was where it all began. And they created a Palestinian national identity, which didn't exist before that. There were plenty of Arabs living there, but they didn't consider themselves Palestinian. That identity had to be created.
Can I just stop you there just a second? What did they consider themselves then,
Arabs.
Colonel?
They were Arabs.
They just thought they were Arabs?
Yeah. There was no... The people who identified as Palestinians were the Jews who were living there.
Okay.
The name became... The land became known as Palestine, and it became the British mandate for Palestine after the Second World War. The Jews living there called themselves Palestinians. The Arabs, generally speaking, didn't. But that identity was created, and part of the propaganda campaign, which began, as I say, orchestrated by the Soviet Union, said that Israel stole the land from the Arabs, and Israel is illegally occupying the land, and therefore it must be liberated. The reality is that from 1948, Israel, and again, I don't want to go into massive details of international law, but from 1948, Israel was the legitimate sovereign throughout the whole of that land, from including the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, as it's sometimes known, and Gaza. All of it was sovereign Israeli territory under international law, and remains so, despite the accusations and the suggestions of the United Nations and other people that it is not. That is the international law case that exists today. And all the stuff, the accusations of illegal occupation, theft of land, all this stuff, that translates into a narrative that says anything that happens to Israel, including the 7th of October, it had it coming. Anything Israel does in response to these attacks is wrong. You can understand that if you say, yes, this is an imperial, illegal, occupying power, then you can understand why that narrative exists. But the basis of the narrative is entirely false.
So coming back to my stupid questions, one of the things I wanted to really get into with you, because you're unique as a guest on our show in that you've spent time in Gaza over the course of the last year, you're former military commander, you understand these things in a way that we don't. One of the big talking points is collateral damage from Israel's campaign in Gaza. And I don't know if this is because we have social media now in a way that we haven't had in previous conflicts, but it's very difficult to avoid the flood of horrific visuals and imagery, people being killed, people burning to death, children with limbs blown off. And if you're a father like the two of us, you look at that and it's very difficult not to feel very strong emotions about it, I think, for any person. At the same time, if you understand combat or history or things like that, you understand that wars always have collateral damage. And so the discussion around that it's somewhat confusing for a layperson again. What do you say to the charge that Israel is either targeting civilians or is attacking in a way that causes unnecessary damage, etc.?
Yeah, and I've heard that many times. And I think it's a commonly held belief, even by people who support Israel generally. The first thing we need to understand, I think, is what Hamas's strategy is here. Hamas, since their inception, since they began to be aggressive against Israel, as soon as they took control of the Gaza Strip, everything they've been doing has been to try to get Israeli retaliation. So they fire rockets, they want Israel to retaliate. They dig tunnels underneath the border to attack Israeli communities, they want Israel to retaliate. Everything they do is about retaliation. They want Israel to retaliate. And they want Israel not just to retaliate, they want Israel to kill their own people, Gazan people. This is the first army in history that I know of that has deliberately wanted its enemy to kill its own civilian population.
What's your evidence for that, Colonel?
Sorry?
What's your evidence for that claim, that the Hamas want their own civilians to be killed?
Every one of their actions, the words of their leaders. I mean, you can look at it on the internet. There are plenty of examples of Hamas leaders saying, we want our people to be sacrificed in the cause of Islam, and etc. It's their policy. It's written down. There are many. I can't quote you chapter and verse now, but there are many. There are many examples where they make it clear this is what their policy is, and there's a reason for it. It's not an irrational policy either. It sounds irrational to us, but the reason for it is because Hamas know they can never really defeat Israel. They may want to, but they know they can't. They're not that strong. No one is that strong, actually, apart from probably the United States if they chose to, but no one in the region. And so the only way of getting rid of Israel is to delegitimize it, is to undermine it, is to bring international opprobrium down on Israel, to isolate Israel, to vilify Israel. And you do that by showing videos and having press pictures of, your children being killed and women being killed and mosques being bombed and schools being blown up. That's how you do it. And it's worked. It's worked very, very well over many years. And the United Nations Human Rights Council, for example, has repeatedly condemned Israel for killing civilians inside Gaza. The pressure piles on, and we've seen it building up much more after the 7th of October. So that's what they want, and everything they do is designed to achieve that. That's why they fight from within civilian populations. That's why they use schools and hospitals and other protected facilities as their command posts, as their weapons storage sites, as their rocket launch sites, and all of that. They wouldn't do that. There's plenty of open space in Gaza. It's described as the most densely populated place in the world, which it isn't, but it is quite densely populated. But there's still plenty of opportunities outside the civilian population. So that's that whether you accept it or don't accept it, that is Hamas's main strategy against Israel, to force Israel to kill their own civilians. And in this war, they know, because they've had a response that they're much more powerful than they expected. They expected the response to be limited and for the US to put a stop to it much, much earlier than now. So they now know the only way they can save themselves is by the war stopping. Hamas is being, as I mentioned before, is being progressively defeated. They cannot survive unless the war is stopped. So the more civilians that die, the more pressure on Israel, the better it is for Hamas. In turning to Israel, when they're confronting a terrorist organization in this situation, they've done everything in their power, and I've witnessed it firsthand, not just in this conflict, but in previous conflicts. The IDF have done everything in their power to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. If you want to kill a terrorist commander or a terrorist rocket system, destroy that, then it's hard. It's very hard to do so without killing civilians if these people are in civilian areas, which they almost invariably are. So the choice is you either don't destroy the terrorists, or you either don't destroy the terrorists and save the civilians, all of the civilians, or you destroy the terrorists and unfortunately have to kill civilians as well. And I find it as troubling as you do. But the laws of war allow that. The laws of war say essentially you're not allowed to deliberately target civilians, you're not allowed to deliberately attack civilians, but if civilians die during the process of combat operations because there are civilians in the area that you need to attack, then that is not illegitimate, it's not illegal, and it happened in wars since time began. What do the IDF do to try and minimize civilian deaths? First of all, they have very comprehensive intelligence about where the enemy are, where the civilian population is, etc. When they're going to attack, let's say, a tower block in Gaza, they will make phone calls, sometimes drop leaflets, send voice messages, text messages, sometimes deliver messages through loudspeakers to tell people to get out. And when they've got out, they then maintain surveillance over the area. And when they think all of the civilians or most of the civilians are gone, only then will they attack the target. And something like, I can't remember the figures, millions of leaflets have been dropped on Gaza, millions of phone calls have been made in Arabic to Gazans, millions of voice messages, text messages have been delivered in an effort to try and get the civilians away from an area that's being targeted. No other army's done anything like that ever in history. There's been something approaching it, but nothing like that. Those are just some. There are other precautions they take as well. Something like 50% of Israeli airstrikes that were planned against terrorist targets in Gaza were aborted because of a civilian presence. So those people who suggest that Israel takes no care and that is only interested in killing terrorists, doesn't matter how many civilians you kill, unfortunately are wrong, or fortunately are wrong. And if you look, it's terrible to reduce human life to statistics. But if we do for a moment, if we take the death toll in Gaza, which has been specified most recently, I think, by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry, they say something like 42,000 civilians have been killed. I don't know whether that number's right, whether it's less, more, I've no idea. But let's take that number, though it's from Hamas. The IDF estimate they have killed 20,000 terrorists. So you take 20,000 from that 42,000 figure. Of course, Hamas don't divide into civilians and military. They just say everyone's a doctor or a nurse or a child or a woman. But you take that roughly half, bit less than half, and then you take away from the remaining numbers those who have been killed by Hamas. Hamas have deliberately murdered large numbers of their own people for disciplinary purposes inside Gaza. They have fired, I think, something like 13% of the rockets they fired have fallen short and landed inside Gaza, some of whom will have killed probably many people. So you take that number away as well from the 42,000. And then you take those who have died from natural causes, which, based on population statistics inside Gaza before the conflict, is going to be in a year around 6,000 plus, maybe 8,000, who have died from natural causes among that number. So that brings it down. It brings it down to, I think, significantly less than one civilian killed for every combatant. Sounds terrible, is terrible. But if you compare it to other conflicts, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the ratio was, in Iraq, 5 civilians killed to every combatant killed. In Iraq, 3 civilians killed to every combatant killed by NATO forces. That shows you, I think, a much more terrible but much more favourable ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in this kind of conflict.